So in this section, we'll look at voting methods, how you would determine the winner of election depending on what your rules are for winning the election. So let's start with two common rules for winning an election in the United States. Plurality is when the candidate with the most votes wins. That's pretty common in the US. There's also something called majority rule. The candidate with more than 50% of the votes wins. So remember, when we talk about 50%, that's another way of saying that is more than half of the votes wins. Okay, so let's look at an example. An election for city commissioner is held, and the votes for four candidates are Gunder gets 1,400, Hugo gets 3,250, Suarez gets 4,000, Aleo gets 1,200. Who would win with plurality? Well, plurality is all about who has the most votes. So when we look at who has the most votes, Suarez has more than anyone. So Suarez would win if we were looking at plurality. However, if we want to talk about who wins with majority rule, that would be someone having over half or more than 50% of the votes. If we add up all of these votes, 1,400 plus 3,250 plus 4,000, plus 1,200, that's actually 9,850 votes overall. And if we want to know what half that is, half of that, dividing by 2, would be 4,925. So you would have to have more than 4,925 to win a majority. You would need more than this for a majority. And no one has more than that amount of votes. Suarez only has 4,000. So no one in this election actually wins majority. Some states and some municipalities require a majority for someone to win an election. So it's important to distinguish between a plurality, which is most votes, and a majority, which is more than half the votes. So if you're a state or a city that requires a majority, what do? Well, if you're required to have a majority and no one gets a majority of the votes, then generally there's something called a runoff. And a runoff can be held in two ways, or there's two common ways, I should say, that a runoff is held. You could have a brand new election after the original one that's held between the top two candidates. This is something you will see around the country. In fact, in Portland, we do this when we elect a mayor. In May, we may have 5 or 10 candidates running for mayor. And then if no one gets a majority of the votes, then we go to a new election in November with just the two candidates who got the top, that were the two top vote-getting candidates. The candidates who got the most votes go on. So in our last example, Suarez got the most votes, so Suarez would go on to the runoff. Hugo got the next most votes, so Suarez and Hugo together would go into a runoff election. And they have time, because of May through to November, to actually campaign and convince other voters to vote for them who maybe voted for someone else in the original election. Now, another way that this can be done is that instead of having a brand new election, voters can rank their preferences for candidates instead of just voting for a single candidate. When you rank your choices, that's called ranked choice voting. And the ballot looks a little different when you have a ranked choice voting. Instead of just checking off one candidate who you want to be the winner, what you would do is you would rank the candidates in terms of who you would prefer first as your first choice compared to your second choice, your third choice, and your fourth choice. So for example, here, person 1 would first choose Suarez. If Suarez wasn't available, they'd then choose Gunder. Neither of those two are available, they choose Aleo, and their last choice will be Hugo. And each person gets to do this. So person 2 has a separate choice ranking, and person 3 again has another separate choice in ranking. And you would continue to do this all the way out. Then what election officials do when it comes to the actual election, they actually look at the first choice ballots. I highlighted that in the wrong color. They look at the first choice ballots first of all, and they look at and they count up how many votes for first choice everybody had. And if there is someone who gets a majority, that person would automatically win. But if no one gets a majority, what they do is they go to the top candidates and they look at the ballots again with preferences with those two candidates in mind. So if we wanted to have a runoff with Suarez and Hugo, we would look at each ballot in terms of preference and circle who would continue on. So again, we're looking past just first choice now. We're looking at the entire person's ballot. So person one, their first choice was Suarez, so actually they would continue to vote for Suarez. So one vote for Suarez here. Person two, their first choice, Aleo, is out of the race because they didn't get enough votes initially. Hugo, though, is still in the race, and so their second choice, their vote would go to Hugo. So now Suarez and Hugo each have a vote. Person three's first choice would be Aleo. Their second choice is Gunder. Now both of those candidates are out. So their third choice would be the person that they end up voting for. And so Suarez gets a second vote. And you would continue to do this until you've gone through all the ballots and counting up how many votes in total Suarez got, looking maybe down as far as fourth place. Well, probably wouldn't go to fourth place because there's only 4 candidates. You'd only go to third place. But you'd continue to go out until you've looked at everyone's ballot. So each person votes for exactly one person that's still in the race. And then you determine who wins based on who has a majority. If you're down to 2 candidates, somebody's going to get a majority. So that's ranked choice voting. Now, when you do ranked choice voting, you will have lots of ballots, and that's going to be kind of hard for us to examine a whole lot of ballots to really get a sense of how it works. So instead, we're going to condense a lot of ballots into what we call a preference schedule. A preference schedule is a way to organize into a single table all of the votes from ranked choice voted ballots in a particular election. And I want to give you an example of that. Let's say we have a 3rd grade class that takes a vote as to their favorite candy. Maybe it's close to Halloween and they're thinking about candy. So let's say we have peanut butter cups, Kit Kats, Snickers, and M&Ms as 4 options. So below here in this table, we have what would be a preference schedule for that vote. What we have at the top are the number of voters, and in the first column, after voters, I have 5 people, and below that 5 are the preferences those 5 people voted for. And those preferences are ranked as first choice, second choice, third choice, and fourth choice down the table. So what this is saying is that 5 people voted for peanut butter cups first, Kit Kat second, Snickers third, M&Ms fourth. And then if we continue across the table, the next column is telling us at the top that 7 people had this choice of preference, M&Ms first, Kit Kats, peanut butter cups, Snickers. And you would continue through that through the entire table. So instead of having a single ballot like I did on the previous slide where you are showing each person individually, if anybody lines up and has the same vote preference, we put them together in the table. And you would continue doing this for all of the different preferences there are. Now I do want to point out that you may notice that there are preferences or rankings that aren't here. For instance, if this were me doing this, I would choose Snickers, I'm just going to abbreviate, and then I would choose peanut butter cups, then I would choose Kit Kats, and M&Ms last. And that isn't in the table. The reason it's not in the table is that none of the kids picked that choice. 0 kids picked that choice. So in a preference schedule, if you don't see a particular list of preferences, that's because no one put that preference list in, and so you don't have to consider it. So I'm going to erase my preferences because I was not part of this 3rd grade class that did this voting on candies. So this is a preference schedule, and it can be helpful for us in terms of analyzing voting methods. So we're going to look at 5 different types of voting methods in this section, and we're going to use preference schedules to be able to examine the votes more closely. So the 5 types of voting methods we're going to look at are plurality, top 2 runoff, instant runoff. So we're going to look at 2 types of runoff: board account, which is a point system balloting system, and then pairwise comparison. So these are the 5 methods we're going to examine.